Hello, everyone. We'll just go ahead and jump in and get started. Welcome to today's webinar event. We're so happy that you're joining us. My name is Bailey Neese. I'm a Programs, Initiatives, and Networks Coordinator with the association. I will hand things over to Sarah and Libby.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's education community webinar. My name is Sarah Fiorello. I'm one of the co-chairs for the education community, along with Libby Rhodes, who's here today with us. And I just want to take just a minute or two just for anyone who's new to attending an education community webinar to just give a quick overview on all the ways that you can engage with the APGA education community. Myself and Libby work together, along with many other people, like these great folks here, to offer opportunities for educational or professional development. And they come in many different forms. We like to offer at least once a season a webinar or other type of virtual engagement throughout the year. We also are in the process for planning an in-person symposium for 2026. We'd love to invite you all to join us in St. Louis at the Missouri Botanic Garden for an APGA Education Community Symposium. So please be looking out for requests for proposals for that, as well as more information on how you can register. In addition, we have a great library of past webinars and other recorded educational offerings, and always a great way to always connect with your colleagues is by posting any questions through the community forum. So if you have any questions, you can contact Libby or myself on how you can get more involved. But I don't want to take any more time away from today's speaker that we're so excited about. So I'd like to hand it over to Emily Hesnes to talk about a great program that she heads up called the PLACCE Initiative.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Libby. We're really excited to be here. I'm here today with Megan Haydett, who is our partnerships manager at the U.S. Botanic Garden. She's going to share a little bit about our partnership with the association on PLACCE.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, my name is Megan Haydett, and I am the partnerships manager, like Emily said. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about partnerships at the U.S. Botanic Garden and our agreement and relationship with APGA to support PLACCE. So partnerships at the U.S. Botanic Garden are strategic. We are intentional about building partnerships as core elements of our strategic plan. Those partnerships focus on conservation, education, and urban agriculture. And one of these partnerships is with APGA to support PLACE. PLACE, or Plants and Climate Change Education, is a peer learning group dedicated to supporting education professionals in public gardens as they engage their audience in learning about the intersection of plants and climate change. We're going to share a link to the PLACE page, and I'm going to tell you a little more. USBG piloted the program from 2022 to 24 with an initial cohort of 6 gardens who developed, tested, and evaluated climate change education programs at their sites. You can learn more about those projects through short videos available on the YouTube that each garden created about their work. Are there any members of that cohort on this webinar? I want to say shout out to Hoyt Arboretum, Lyon Arboretum, Naples Botanic Garden, Ryman Gardens, UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden, and US Botanic Garden. We participated as well. We also have developed an online series of climate change education professional development webinars, also available on the USBG YouTube channel. So you can see that link in the chat. Now, we are partnering again with APGA to support a new cohort. We're calling it PLACE 2.0. Are there any members of this new cohort? You can say hello in the chat, or I can give a shout out to Botanical Garden of the Piedmont, Trees Atlanta, National Tropical Botanical Garden at the Kampong, Missouri Botanic Garden, Gardens at Golden Gate Park. And again, we are also participating. Part of our work is to bring new ideas relevant to climate change education to our public gardens and education professional community. Being able to partner with APGA and collaborate on these kinds of events with the APGA education community helps us do that. And we're really excited to bring Kathayoon Khalil to speak to everyone today. Emily, take it over for an introduction.
Thanks so much, Megan. Just to get everybody ready to go, I wanted to say just a word about how our format's going to go today. So there will be a talk by Kathayoon and then some moderated Q&A. So we encourage you to please ask your questions throughout the talk, and we will take time following the talk to address all of those questions and hopefully have some great conversation. So just want to give people a heads up about how that's going to look. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker. Dr. Kathayoon Khalil is the Vice President and Director of the Columbus Center for Wildlife Conservation at the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Khalil is an accomplished conservation leader with more than 20 years of experience in environmental education, conservation strategy, and program evaluation. In her current role, she oversees all conservation programming and projects for the Columbus Zoo and the Wilds, advancing partnerships in conservation science toward impactful programs that connect people with nature and drive impactful conservation efforts locally and globally. Before joining the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium, Dr. Khalil worked at the New England Aquarium and the Oregon Zoo, and she completed her PhD in Education, Learning Sciences, and Technology Design at Stanford University. She's the lead author of a recent publication for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is entitled Core Competencies for Conservation Education, which is the focus of our session today. When Megan shared that document with our team here at the U.S. Botanic Garden, I immediately saw so many connections to the work that we do in public gardens and in climate change education that I asked if we could have a conversation, and was thrilled that Dr. Khalil agreed to share this work with our public gardens education community through today's webinar. I'm really excited to see where this discussion takes us. So thanks so much for joining us, Kathayoon, and I will turn things over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily. All right. We tried screen sharing before. We're going to try it again. Presentation mode. All right. Can you see my screen? Are we all good there? Did I do it? I didn't do it.
No,
I don't see it yet.
There.
Oh, it's coming.
Okay, great. Perfect. All right. Hello, everybody. It is really great to be here with you all. Like Emily gave a wonderful introduction, but for the purposes of this conversation, I will add to that by saying that though I work on the conservation side of things currently, I am and will always be an educator at heart. I started out as a teen volunteer and worked in zoo camp for 10 years, and throughout the course of that role really thought a lot about what it means to be an education professional, which is how we got here. So I'm going to share a bit about our journey, a bit about what the core competencies look like, and then open it up for a conversation, because though this is specifically created for conservation education with a focus on animals, I absolutely believe that this could be adapted for your audiences as well. All right. So this project came about in the midst of the pandemic. There was a massive brain drain in the zoo and aquarium community, particularly related to educators who lost their jobs when our facilities closed for extended periods of time. There was one conversation I had where a person I love and respect very much told me, when push comes to shove, a keeper can do what an educator does, and we need the keeper more. And a friend of mine retorted that she, as an educator, could throw meat at the animals, but that doesn't make it animal care. And so that led us down this road of thinking about, okay, what does it really mean to be an educator? Is it just talking to people about the animals in our care, or is there something bigger here that we should be able to define? And maybe we, as a community, as an education community, haven't done a great job of defining this thus far. So maybe this is a contribution we can make. So we thought a lot about, in those early conversations, what it means to be a professional, what it means to do this as your career, and borrowed this, this definition, one of many, on the topic of professionalism. But we really attached ourselves to this idea of a well-defined body of knowledge and skills, something you can't get from another group of individuals at your facility. And so when we created this, in the one hand, it was to potentially help the immediate problem with the brain drain that I mentioned, but also to just think about, in the post-pandemic rebuild, which I believe many of us are still in, we wanted to be able to create a structure and a scaffold that would prevent that kind of brain drain from occurring again. So what do we mean by competencies? When we thought about competencies, we really attached ourselves to three areas: the abilities, knowledge, and skills that someone would need to be a competent or an effective conservation education professional. When looking at that, we decided, oh, that picture didn't show up as cute as I wanted it to, but we decided that we wanted to create a document, a framework that would have both cross-cutting foundational principles as well as specific buckets of work that we called a competency. We looked at a lot of other different frameworks because there are so many out there, and we were definitely not the first or only people to embark on this effort. A lot of jobs like nursing, engineering, teaching have competency frameworks already. And so we turned to some of the correlates within our own field, such as the North American Association for Environmental Education's Guidelines for Excellence. So if you have not read those, they are a collection of, I think, 7 now, documents of best practices, ranging from climate justice education to K-12 environmental education to community engagement and informal education. And we, even though those are subject specific in each one of those tomes or those volumes, we still believe them to be a really great foundation for what we were trying to do. We also looked at the Visitor Studies Association professional competencies, as well as the National Science Foundation's Informal Science Learning Professional Learning Framework. One of our folks on our committee or on our writing team, Joe Heimlich, has been very involved in the ISL work, and so he was a great asset for us in thinking about how to link our work to that body. And then the American Evaluation Association's evaluator competencies played a big role as well, as you will see that evaluation plays a significant part in the competency of a conservation education professional. So what did we do? So this all started with a group of us sitting around in a round table at a conference saying, we have to crack this nut, we have to solve this problem. Something is happening, and it's up to us as conservation education professionals or self-proclaimed to think about what to do next. It wasn't an edict that came from our association. It wasn't anybody's job that, their boss told them they had to do this. This was truly a group of friends, honestly, and colleagues, those of us who consider each other to be part of a brain trust of like 20 to 25 people who said, this feels like something we should do. Let's get started and see what happens. So what we did was we went through a timeline series, which I will show you in just a second. But these are the questions we asked at each of those points. And we tried to engage successively larger and larger groups of people in these conversations. But the formative question was, what are the buckets of work unique to zoo and aquarium education? What's special about what we do? I think every field likes to think of themselves as special, and every field likes to say that they're unlike any other, but that is true to an extent. So what are those really unique pieces? Then we asked people to react to what we had come up with. What did you see that you liked? What did you see that was missing? Which got us even more information. So then we would refine all of that data and share it again. And then we went through basically what ended up being a qualitative coding process where we would lump things together and form buckets and then go back to the beginning and say, Now let's talk about this. Is this a bucket of work that is unique to the zoo and aquarium profession? And did that over and over and over again. Timeline wise, we started out with that AZA roundtable that we delicately called the Education Evolution Revolution. Then we did a workshop and some sessions at the annual conference in 2023. We have a professional development school within the association that happens in West Virginia and now regular Virginia, where we took, our 2 classes of emerging and emerged conservation education professionals and asked them to work with all of the material. And then we took it back to another AZA conference in 2024. And then in that time, asked the association if they would be willing to co-publish this with us as an official AZA document built and created by members. Which brings us to now. We were able to formally roll out the core competencies like 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago. So this will be I'll talk about what's coming next, but they're still very new in the world, and we're also working on a peer-reviewed paper for publication, just in case the AZA ever decides to take that document down or we edit it or change it. We want to have something in the peer-reviewed literature that marks this moment in time and is evergreen in that sense. So this is what we came up with. This is the big reveal. Like I mentioned, we had core competencies and foundational principles, and I will talk about the foundational principles first and then go into the core competencies, but I want to stop for a second and talk about how we got to this framework. So after that first session, we ended up with giant Post-it note sheets of different, bodies of work that people had decided on. They weren't called these things that they're loving, like all the nice wordsmithing you see here, but they were the approximations of these topics. And we took them out into a hallway and just laid them all out in the conference room hallway and talked about like, wait, does this go with this and this goes with this, and came up with some pretty interesting revelations, one of which being that safety and well-being seem to come out in almost every conversation, that the job of a conservation education professional within a zoo or aquarium has to incorporate elements of keeping the participants safe and tending to the mental, emotional, and physical well-being of our students or learners, whatever age group you want to call them. There's also a big equity and justice piece that kept coming out that we felt like couldn't be its own bucket. There was equity and justice in content. There was equity and justice in collaboration. There's equity and justice in conservation capacity building. And that's when we realized maybe we need something foundational that goes a cross-cutting theme, is what we called them initially, that matches with each one of these competencies in its own unique way. Conservation impact and evaluation was also one of those. It was one that I knew going into it was going to play a part. I just didn't know what kind of part it was going to play. And when we talked about it, evaluation as a practice felt like it needed to sit alongside safety and well-being and equity and justice as a foundational principle, as opposed to a core competency in and of itself. Then when we pulled those out, we were able to see more clearly what the competencies really could be. Content and engagement was the one that came out first. That was pretty simple or pretty straightforward to see that there's a content expertise that is required, but also an interpretive expertise. Like, how do we talk about this? The act of communicating the topics that we want to discuss with our audiences. Collaboration and relational expertise, evidence-based practice, and conservation capacity building all also fell out as a result of kind of the more we pulled out of those other sections, the more we were able to see what was left and bunch those into groups accordingly. So this is a lot of words, but I'm just pulling out for you all our kind of bylines for each of the main topical areas, so you can see what we really mean by each of these topics. So for conservation impact and evaluation, the words I want to pull out for you here is that, the goal of our programs is to have a positive impact on conservation. That's why we're conservation educators. not even it's a subset of environmental education. Environmental education has a slightly different focus and bend, but conservation education gets really specific around moving people towards action for the purpose of conserving the natural world. We have organizational missions that we attach ourselves to, and assessing learner outcomes and having feedback loops that identify areas of improvement or success is germane to the work that we're doing, because conservation is changing so rapidly, and because the fields of human dimensions and conservation psychology are always offering us new things that we need to incorporate into our practice. Equity and justice is probably the most straightforward. Engaging in conservation education should be an equitable and inclusive experience. And that's the role of a conservation education professional, to pay attention to that and make sure that we are tending to the needs of our participants, regardless of their identities or experiences, or in honoring and upholding the experiences and identities of our participants. And then safety and well-being, ensuring the physical and psychological safety of guests and participants is a top priority. Like I said, this was a really interesting one to have come out so strongly. But as we talked about it more, it made sense. A lot of educators do animal handling. We work in a facility where we have live animals, sometimes live dangerous animals. And so we have to be trained on protocols and safety procedures so that we can make sure we're positively contributing to people's experiences and providing them with safe experiences in our parks. But that's not the only thing that came out. There's this idea of the whole person, the physical, social, emotional needs, and how conservation educators end up tending to those as well, especially when we talk about the work that we do with children. A lot of times we develop strong relationships with our learners, and so we wanted to be able to honor that and say that a strong conservation education professional knows what to do with that responsibility and is able to enhance the well-being of their participants through their educational experience. And then we had our 4 main core competency areas. So like I mentioned, content and engagement, translating content in a way that engages a wide array of audiences. We talked about a big part of that being able to identify and assess your audience in the moment, and then change your tack so that it is appropriate for the audience that you're speaking to. You see that these say should be able to ... Hold on to that, because I'll show you in the next slide what that ... led to in our framework. Evidence-based practice. This was really about understanding the research that goes into bridging research to practice, understanding the research that is germane to our field and being able to use that research in a way that helps you to advance your practice. This was an interesting one as well, because all of the people who worked on this writing team consider themselves to be practitioners or have had a background in practice. But many of us also hold the duality of living in an academic world, either through our training or currently through our positions or even adjunctships, etc. And so we wanted to be able to pull this out and say there is so much good literature out there that would help the zoo and aquarium world to do better education. And it is a responsibility of educators to be able to integrate that into their teaching or their practice. Collaboration and relational expertise, a big part of what we found when we talked to different educators. So I think I didn't mention this, but in all, I think there are a couple hundred educators involved, and over 900 hours of engagement that we did with different groups of educators. We also had some of our writing teams do smaller focus groups within their own regions, where they were able to work with the document in its more refined forms and offer more big picture thematic feedback, which is really helpful. And a lot of people talked about the fact that educators often become the bridge between among a lot of different departments, not only within the zoo, but also outside as well, working with community groups, creating partnerships with schools and natural resource practitioners, other museums and education facilities. And so conservation educators often need to have a level of expertise in how to build and maintain those relationships in a meaningful and mutually respectful way. And then conservation capacity building, again, heralding to that idea that conservation and education are inextricably connected when it comes to our work. And so we need to be able to build programs that respond to conservation issues, because that's what makes us conservation educators as opposed to science educators or environmental educators or engineering educators. We could be all those things, but also conservation education is the biggest umbrella that we fall under. So the way we structured our competencies, every competency is structured just a little bit, every competency document that we looked at structured just a little bit differently. And so this is how we decided we wanted to do ours. So for example, content and engagement has that byline that I mentioned, that I read to you before. And then underneath it, it has different tasks that fall under that bucket. So for content and engagement, this isn't all of the ones in that bucket, but these are some of them. Within content and engagement, we have tasks related to audience analysis, lesson delivery, resource development. And for each one of those, we created a very brief 1-line or 2-line explanation of what that looks like for a conservation education professional. So for example, audience analysis, be flexible and adjust for the dynamic needs of an audience using data-informed and observational determinations. For resource development, create accurate and effective educational materials for various audiences. And we wordsmithed the heck out of these. We chose what we thought to be the nice balance between being too specific and too general, and always keeping our eye on what would be most useful for our audience that we were writing this for. And then with our foundational principles, we wrote little blurbs that specifically, what does conservation impact and evaluation mean in terms of content? What does equity and justice mean in terms of content? And that was done for all 4 of the principles. So we have those cross-cutting themes, but I was sure to articulate how those cross-cutting themes applied to each of the bucket areas that we were really interested in. So for example, for equity and justice, using appropriate engagement strategies to increase access, inclusion, and equity for diverse audiences while examining content through a justice lens. We don't want to be too, diagnosy. We don't want to tell people what to do too much, but just generally point them in the direction of the goal that we think that we would like to see for the ultimate or for the optimal result in our programming. So I'm not going to show you the entire document here because it does live online, and I'm happy to pull it up as we have our conversation. It ended up being like 10 pages long or something. It's actually quite concise, which I appreciated. A couple of really important notes that I want to share. First of all, there are competency frameworks that include rubrics to say, like, this is a beginner, this is an intermediate, this is an advanced level. We decided not to do that, in part because we were pretty done with the project. Like I said, it was volunteer-based, and we found that we'd come to a natural stopping point where what we had was what we wanted to share with our community. We're not opposed to someone doing that kind of rubric. And in fact, we've already had members of our community step up and say, hey, I created a self-assessment for my team based on the core competencies. Here's what I came up with. Let me know if you like it or whatever. And it's really cool to see members of the community take this and make it their own. The other thing I really, really, really want to hammer home is that it was never the intention, nor is it, never the intention that one person do all of these things. So we say that in the beginning. I have a preamble where we talk about kind of what I talked about at the beginning, but also just making sure that everyone knows that you're going to be everyone on your team is going to be in different places when it comes to the core competencies. And no one person is going to be able to embody all of these competencies to the fullest extent. That's not the point, right? The point is threefold. On the individual level, we imagine that an individual could take this document and say, okay, I'm really good in these areas, but I'm kind of lacking in these areas. I'm going to ask my boss for some professional development opportunities in this piece. Or I'm brand new to this field and I really want to do conservation education and I'm not really sure where to start. Oh, I should get some skills in these areas. Or even I'm applying for a job and I want to be able to highlight that I'm the best conservation education professional for this position, here are the areas I'm going to make sure are covered in my resume and cover letter. Then on the departmental level, we encourage departments to take stock of their existing expertise and say, where are we already excelling? Where do we have people who are really good at content and engagement and evidence-based practice, but we're kind of missing some people with that collaboration or relational expertise? Okay, great. That's the next position that we can hire for, or the qualities that we would be looking for in our next successful candidate. So we imagine this being used as a way to fill out a department, because I can imagine that a department has expertise in all of these different areas. And then lastly, at the organizational level, we imagine this being used as a way to serve the original purpose that that drove us to create this in the first place, creating a case for conservation education and being able to say that, hey, conservation education workers are professionals. This is a career with skills, qualifications, schooling, abilities, and it should be regarded, respected, and resourced as such. So we're in the socializing phase of the next steps right now. What that means is we're just trying to get it out there as much as possible. So I was blown away and so excited to see that my initial post on LinkedIn got 13,000 impressions, which was crazy. I'm no social media expert, but that feels like a big number to me. But we want to see that number grow. We want to get more people posting it on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on whatever, because I want to live in a world where everybody is at least aware that this document exists, has read it through, and finds something in it that can help them be a better professional. I spoke at the National Academy of Sciences on a panel about professional development within the zoo and aquarium world. We have this conversation, which is so wonderful. And the National Sustainability Summit coming up in October. So there's a bunch of different places where we're taking this work outside of the AZA, and I think those are the coolest conversations to have, because as much as we want people within AZA to use this, we want people outside of AZA to see it and say, hey, this is cool, like we could make something like this for ourselves. We have AZA 2025 in Tampa, where a bunch of us will be getting together and doing what we're calling the Core Competency Roadshow, and going to the different committees of AZA to give a presentation not unlike this one, and being able to encourage other areas of the association to think about whether something like this could be helpful for them. How does this apply to a volunteer management professional? How does this apply to an animal care professional, a veterinary professional, et cetera, et cetera? Going back to that professional development school or professional development program that we have, we're thinking about how do we structure the school now to reflect this document and say, if these are what the teaching team thinks are the most important skills of a conservation education professional, then we should be teaching to that curriculum. And so we're thinking about how we integrate that into our zoo school. And then beyond, anything is possible, and we're open to seeing how this grows and develops. The last thing we want is for this to sit on a shelf. So we will do anything within our power to make sure that it does not, and that it is used by as many people as possible in whatever ways that they find it to be useful. So that's the end of my formal presentation. I forgot to put a slide thanking all of the other people on our team, but I am going to instead cheat and pull up the document, which I think you can probably see. So in case you're interested in looking at it more fully, it lives on the Association of Zoos and Aquariums website currently. This is what it looks like right now. It's all pretty and branded. We have our introduction, our how to use, an explanation of the structure. We changed the colors a little bit, but not much. And then each element of the framework, like I mentioned, has these key tasks and then the foundational principles, the key tasks and the foundational principles. And then I was going to come here to tell you that I would really like to acknowledge the wonderful writing team that is Rachel Bashor from Riverbanks, Joy Kuberik from Inform Evaluation and Research, Megan Medley from the San Diego Zoo, Trevor Mia from New England Zoo New England, and Jim Morton from Connecticut's Beardsley Zoo. We also had a wonderful advisory team, the names of which you will see here. But none of this would have happened without the collective kind of passion, willingness to just say yes and see what happens next from this community of educators. So I'm very, very thankful to them. One of them, Megan Medley, in a conference session called this our love letter to conservation education. And I just think that's a wonderful way of expressing it because it truly is. All right. I'm going to stop my share and move into the part where we have a conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was a great overview, inspiring work. Really exciting to hear about the process and then what it led to. So thanks so much. We invite people to ask questions here in the chat. I've got questions too. So we'll have a conversation and hear what people want to hear more about. We have a question from Andrew who said, "This is amazing. Thanks so much for this resource." And was asking, are there any specific high-level points of contention, or were there any among participants as you developed the document, and how did you work through any disagreements of view or differences of opinion?
What a good question. Did I just black them out? I think one of the points of dissension that I remember was around this idea of like, gosh, there were so many little ones. I don't think there was a really big one. There were little ones around like, okay, so everyone's talking about how they run trainings and how they facilitate workshops. Is that really our job, or are we just doing other duties as assigned? You know, that idea that like, yes, there's your job, and then there's other things that you do because you talk nice, and so people who talk nice get pulled in to do presentations or trainings or facilitate. But then as we talked about that specific one more, we were like, okay, well, maybe that wasn't our job to start, but it is our job now. And it's a skill that a lot of us feel like we share. Again, not every person has to do everything, but that is pretty pervasive from what we're hearing from all education professionals. And so we incorporated that. One thing we did not incorporate as strongly, which was interesting, was animal handling. Like, yes, animal handling is important, but more and more educators aren't necessarily doing the animal handling. And so we made a nod to it, but we didn't create a whole section on like, animal handling protocols or animal safety or whatever. It kind of got lumped into safety and well-being writ large. But working through the disagreements, I think just some pretty classic facilitation exercises of asking folks what felt wrong, what felt right, having them do individual work, pair work, group work, and then reconciling any big issues like where do we put safety and well-being as a group. But then really it was nice to have that core writing team because we made the executive decisions because someone has to. But at least we were making them based on some pretty good data.
Thank you. The answer to this might be no, because it sounds like there weren't any major disagreements, but I was curious about just the decisions to start with conservation education. And at the outset of the process, like, did you have consensus about situating the profession of zoo and aquarium education under that banner of conservation education? Why not just say, here's education in zoos and aquariums, but to really take a conservation focus? What was the discussion around that?
Yeah, I think that verbiage has changed and shifted over even the course of my tenure in this field, where, we used to just be called the education department, then we were the conservation education department, and then we were the conservation engagement department. Like there are so many different iterations, but when we talked about it, the conservation piece seemed to be what really made us unique, right? And yes, Lindsay, hi, Lindsay. The distinction of conservation education being a subset of environmental education, not dissimilar from how conservation psychology is distinct but embedded within environmental psychology as a concept. And this idea that there is an urgency in zoos and aquariums, and I would expect botanic gardens as well, where the plants, animals, the beings in your care are living creatures that may die, and the urgency of life and death is the core of conservation, where we're trying to create healthy, thriving human and natural populations that are able to live in concert with one another. And it felt different when you have, one of the only elephants born in the US this year in your facility and you're talking about elephant conservation. Like, that urgency just feels stronger when the living creature is right in front of you. And so conservation really spoke to that in a way that made sense to us. And once we put that stake in the ground, we didn't really get any pushback on it. So we just kept driving that stake in.
Yeah, thank you. The interest in distinction between conservation education and environmental education made me also think about climate change education and how in the zoo and aquarium world do you see the intersection of climate change education and conservation education happening?
Yes, great question. It depends on where you live and work, right? A lot of our friends and colleagues who we say are working kind of on the front lines of the conservation and climate crisis are not able to talk about climate change in those terms, or are not able to discuss sustainability in the same ways that some of us who live in different political and social environments are able to. And so we made the decision, especially if you look at the time frame within which we were working, to not specifically call out climate change, because that's one content area that we work on. We also are not specifically calling out human-animal coexistence or, marine debris or plastic. Like, these are all different content areas, and some zoos and aquariums may double down on their climate education, and some may say that's just not where we are right now. And we wanted to leave space for all of that. And so you'll see that's where I meant, like, threading the needle between the specific and the general is we're not going to call out specific content areas. We're just going to say, like, these are the expectations for how you should approach developing content expertise, or especially evidence-based practice. Like, regardless of what topic you're teaching on, you need to be able to speak with the best available science and the most current literature on that topic, because people are looking to us to be their source of information. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That connects to one of the specific principles that I was curious about, the evidence-based practice competency. You talked about
Yeah.
Engaging in research to advance the field of zoo education and being research literate. And you just referenced that right now. I'm curious, like, how do zoo and aquarium educators, or how do you think they can establish that baseline understanding of what work has been done that's relevant to the work that they do, and then keep themselves up to date too? Because I think that's a question we have in public gardens as well.
Yeah. This is a strong passion area of mine, having come from, studied at two Research One universities, Yale and Stanford, and then leaving academia very willingly and excitedly to come back to the zoo and aquarium world, but really seeing some, like, cool stuff happening in those academic spaces that just wasn't getting translated to my brilliant friends and colleagues who are working on the front lines in practice every single day. And I'm not the only one. We have several members of our teaching team who felt that distinction as well. And so I think one way for us in the zoo and aquarium community, again, adapt this at will, but we created a social science research and evaluation scientific advisory group within the AZA. And so I'm the current chair of that group. Amy Needbalski preceded me and was the founding chair from St. Louis Zoo. And we get all the social scientists. You're right, Lindsay, conservation education is just one of the conservation social sciences. There are so many others. And I would say education is a practice of conservation social science, although anyway. And we got all the social science practitioners and researchers together in this group. And first of all, in 2020, created a social science research agenda for the association, like 15 to 18 of us, that was meant to last 10 years and kind of outlined the big questions in zoos and aquariums that we thought, hey, if a graduate student wanted to pick this up and study something, this would be great, or a research team or whatever. And then right now, the Social Science Research and Evaluation SAG, Scientific Advisor Group, is conducting a midterm review, so a 5-year review of the existing literature, published gray literature, dissertations, theses, anything we can get our hands on, to say, in 5 years, this is what we've done. And for the next 5 years, this is where we should focus. And we opened participation to that process up to anybody and everybody who wanted to at least get their feet wet and practice what it looks like to do a literature review. So we posted on some of our internal listservs. I'm a professor for Project Dragonfly, so I posted to my Dragonflies. We got like, I don't know, 40 to 50 people who wanted to participate in addition to the SAG, which is really awesome. And I hope it doesn't scare them away from social science work, but we want to be able to provide more opportunities like that. I think the other example I'll give is the empathy project that I worked on while I was at Seattle Aquarium. That was a really great example of taking research and making it digestible for practitioners. We created papers, but more importantly, trainings that we were able to do in like, I don't know, 55 states, not states, we only have 50 states, 55 facilities all over the country and several internationally, to say like, hey, this is the research, we consolidated it for you. Now let's talk about how to make it practice-based. Like, what do we do with that? And I have seen a lot of people take that and run with it to the point where now when I go to the conference, like none of the original research team is doing the presentations. It's all folks who have taken this and made it their own, which is just exactly what you want to see. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great sign.
Yeah.
There was a question in the chat. Somebody was asking that they were looking in the document and they didn't see a specific definition that you all used for conservation. Was there one, or what was the discussion around that?
No, every institution has a different definition of conservation. So it's funny. I just got tied up in this in my own work life, that we were talking about, like, do we need a definition of conservation here at this facility? And my argument was no. I think more what we need is who we are as we approach conservation, because conservation is changing, right? It used to be that conservation was protecting animals or preserving species, but now we're seeing so much more conversation around humans that human empowerment is the basis of conservation, or community engagement is the basis of conservation. And I don't want us to get too tied up in saying what is or isn't conservation. I want us more to focus on the bigger picture. And that might also be my bend, because I don't do details very well. But just thinking about, like, conservation is an action-oriented practice. You can't passively conserve. You have to actively do something to change the paradigm, because the paradigm we're living in is largely extractive. And so however an institution wants to design their conservation programming, I encourage them to get educators involved in that process and in that definition creation. But once you have defined that, again, why we weren't prescriptive, that's the word I was looking for, why we weren't prescriptive about saying, like, you need to be able to do behavior change campaigns, because while right now behavior change campaigns are very hot, what if that changes in the next couple of years and we have a new understanding? Instead, the more important thing is to stay on top of the research and understand how to integrate new practices into your work, instead of saying that this practice right this second is the most important thing.
Yeah, it's a challenge to keep it broad and
Yes.
keep it flexible, because you wanted
Yes.
to be relevant, for a lot of different kinds of organizations and over time.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And we have such a diverse membership, right? Like every year more zoos and aquariums get added. There's, over 240 something institutions. And so I didn't necessarily think that it was worth us trying to come up with a Goldilocks definition that would work for every single person in every single institution. What I wanted is, once you have that understanding, everyone's mission is going to be different too. But, like, the point isn't to come up with a common mission. The point is to come up with common practices within the mission to help advance that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious about if public gardens education community wanted to think about defining its own unique buckets of work, because maybe our buckets are similar, maybe they're different. There's certainly some crossover. How would you suggest getting started in something like that?
Literally, our first step was we borrowed 2.5 hours of our Conservation Education Committee meeting. So I hear you have this summit coming up. Maybe it's something you could do. there, and we gave people big Post-it notes. And I think I have the questions somewhere. I'm happy to share them with you. And we just had people work within their groups. I'm like stalling a little to see if I can find those questions in an old PowerPoint. We had people work within their groups to come up with a laundry list of things that they thought represented conservation education. Oh, yes, I do have it. Where did it go? No, I overshot. Okay, back. So we asked them, there's a lot more explanation. We did some case studies. What did we ask? What I mentioned, what did you, oh, that wasn't it. That was one step too far. I may need to look and get back to you because I know one of us has that somewhere. But it's living in some Canva far, far away.
No worries.
Yeah, but that was it. I mean, we just got together and talked about like, okay, so what does it mean to be a conservation education professional? What are some of the things that you think every conservation education professional should be able to do? You know, questions like that. And it was like maybe like 50 people. And that's, you know, we did that. We did a Mentimeter where we had people put extra stuff up on the screen after they'd heard what all the groups had done, if there were extra things they wanted. And then we took all that data and literally sat on the floor and like moved things around. And we're like, okay, here's some scrappy buckets. Like, let's start there. And then took it to another group and said, react to this. What do you think? So, I mean, it is, I think the hardest part is just to do the first thing, right? Which is get that group of people together and say, hey, what we want to create something. This is what it looks like at the end when we have created it. We looked at a lot of examples. We showed people different case studies and then jump right in. I mean, the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to get data that's not that helpful, but not that helpful data also helps you decide what you would ask to get more helpful data.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it sounds like you all, like us, have, your conference and your in-person gatherings that happen, at least annually. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, are there other ways that zoo and aquarium education professionals interact to advance their professional growth and conservation education? And what do those look like?
Yeah, we have forums online. We have the My AZA, and you get a daily digester. It's a very active, I subscribe to the education one, the conservation psychology one, the social science research one. Like committees can have them and also topical areas. And so we sent some of these out, in those channels so that people could take a look and react to them that way. I disseminated them to some of my graduate students. Like again, this wasn't a research project per se. It had research elements and research underpinnings, but it was for practitioners by practitioners ultimately. And so we went until we felt like we had a critical mass and that we were hearing the same things over and over. We went until we found saturation, basically. And so I think a lot of times, as brilliant people that we are, we want to overthink it and come up with the absolute most perfect process first. But we didn't even know if there was a there. And we just decided to do this 2-hour session at our mid-year conference. We're like, oh, okay, yeah, there's enough here. Let's keep going. We kept going until we felt like, okay, we have enough. We have enough now. But yeah, I think that's the big thing that helps. Yes, ICCB is great. WAZA is great. We also, that's another good one. We also intersected with the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums and their framework and plan for conservation education for the next, their conservation education strategy was really helpful. And we wanted to make sure we were playing nicely with that. So we weren't totally far afield of what the larger global community was talking about. So we had the folks from that team read over it and take a look, and also making sure that we are playing nicely with the AZA strategic plan as well, to say that like this fits in with the larger strategy of where zoos and aquariums are going.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I noticed that connection to the AZA strategic plan.
Mhm.
We too have a new strategic plan in the
I
American Public Gardens
know.
Association. And it's exciting that like one big element of that plan is professional development. And there's specific objectives around things like specialized training and certification and things like that. Could you see core competencies guiding something like certification or things
Oh,
like that in
absolutely.
conservation education? Is that a
Yes.
conversation that goes on in your
Yeah.
community?
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. I just sent a letter or an email to our head of professional development for AZA and said, hey, she'd been helping us with this all along to get like the AZA perspective. And I was like, do you think this is something the board of directors that should get in front of the board of directors for AZA just so they're aware that this exists, right? And this was created by their members. And so making sure that like not only people within your echo chamber have it, but as you feel more confident in your product, taking it to the larger APGA community and getting their reactions, I think would be necessary. I'm not even going to say helpful, but I think critical to making sure that it lives within the strategic plan and it feels like something people have ownership over.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah.
Getting it outside of your echo chamber is a great point. Uh,
Yeah.
are there audiences that you all talked about potentially benefiting from the core competencies that are like maybe not the obvious audiences, like obviously us as educators and our institution
Yeah.
had
I'm
conversations about who else?
yeah, I mean, I think CEOs of cultural facilities can benefit from this and understanding how they can advocate for education more effectively. I think some leadership who have experience with education are already bought in, but that's definitely not everybody. And so we wanted to create something that would use data to speak to what we knew to be true, that educators are professionals, but that may not be widely accepted in the same ways you think of a veterinarian as being a professional and having, skills and expertise related to their area of work. So, yes, that's a big one. I think outside of it, a lot of us share on the writing team share the passion of elevating the profile of zoos and aquariums in the global conservation community. And so beyond, our fellow zoo and aquarium folks, we want other conservationists, who work in places like land trusts and government and WWF and all those places to see what zoo and aquarium conservationists have to offer and the skills that they're bringing to these complex problems that we're all trying to solve. So I would love to be able to share this beyond, and I have been very excited about sharing this beyond the zoo and aquarium community, because I think it does speak to the the professionalism and kind of the evolution or revolution of the zoo and aquarium world writ large, because zoos and aquariums of today are light years different than maybe what people have in their mind that we used to be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing it
Sure
with
is true
us.
for, yes, I'm sure it's true for botanic gardens too.
Yeah. I'm interested in there's an idea in the content and engagement competency that's around conservation communication. And you
Mm-hmm.
talk about translate and format conservation research and issues into information that various audiences can understand. And I was
Mm-hmm.
curious, how does conservation education or the work of educators connect with the conservation biology work that happens in
Mm-hmm.
zoos and aquariums? I suppose there's probably a spectrum of that, but I think that's something that we see in our institutions and gardens too. There might be a
Yeah.
conservation research team or a plant science research team, and then there's educators. And
Yeah.
how do you see them interacting,
Yeah.
or do you have examples of like cool collaborations that you've seen?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, a question people always want to know is how is the zoo contributing to conservation? And what they really mean is how are zoo scientists learning more about animals to contribute to their well-being, right? And so I love to get educators involved in our hellbender releases or our American burying beetle releases or work with our partners in the Marianas or, you know, in in Asia with elephants, just so they can not just I'm not speaking about just the biology because our scientists also include our social scientists, but understanding how the different sciences contribute to conserving species, both on the natural, physical, and social sides. And so having them do hands-on work is a really big one, but also just you're talking about climate change, science like that, and climate communications. Climate communications is all about translating what could be arguably conservation research and taking it and making it something that people can understand, because the climate crisis is very challenging, from a chemical physical perspective, but we're trying to make it into something that people who don't have advanced degrees, or even some that do, can take and make into a practical application for their lives and livelihoods. And so that is the perfect example of like, we want it to be broad enough to say we're not saying translate and format climate change research or, habitat connectivity research. We're talking about conservation research that applies to the work that you're doing. I think connectivity is a great one, like talking about solutions-oriented projects that connect corridors or fragmented landscapes is all based on ecological research, but has very practical applications for literally helping animals to cross roads, and get to water and food sources and get to each other. And so people love hearing about those solutions because it's very concrete, but it is also based on a large body of data.
Yeah, that importance of showing impact and
Yeah.
that connects to the evaluation piece.
Yeah. And like why the road here, why the bridge here, like that's all based on, so talking about that kind of, and if you're talking to kids about that, there's, games and kinesthetic ways of teaching versus adults and the, questioning and Socratic method. So just being able to adapt that to your audience.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. Like you talked about the importance of assessment of learner outcomes too.
Yes.
And like we know there's challenges in the informal science education world to doing that. Do you have any like favorite approaches that you've seen in the zoo world for assessing conservation education learning outcomes?
So many, and you should
Yeah,
read my book, Practical Evaluation for Conservation Education and Outreach. I wrote
awesome.
Kate Clavio. We published it in 2018. It was pulling from a lot of the best evaluations that we'd seen in the field, not just in zoos and aquariums, but in conservation ed more broadly, including soil, water, land trusts and community groups, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was kind of our, hey, if everyone knew these things about evaluation, we could have more interesting conversations about other creative ways. But my big, I don't know, passion area was an embedded evaluation. When I was doing my evaluation work, I was mostly working with young children. So, K through 5, and maybe 6th and 7th graders. But really looking at how to evaluate their learning in a way that wasn't disruptive to the learning itself, that wasn't an additional piece, but was actually just taking the games, the activities that we were already doing and just asking some additional framing questions together and creating data collection tools that would allow us to mine data from activities that were already engaging kids. But now we could just ask them a few things about their processing, and it became data about whether or not that diorama was actually demonstrating a learning outcome or was just, gluing things together.
Yeah, thanks. Good tip.
Yeah.
We'll check that out. I know Megan has it.
Yes, she does. Yeah, she texted me a photo. It's still out
Yeah,
there. We have
so
to do 2.0 sometime because apparently it's been
yeah.
7 years, which is
Oh,
there
there
it
she
is.
is. She's got it there.
Yeah.
So another great resource. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you think about just the value of being able to describe like what you call the diverse and dynamic job of a conservation education professional, how do you think of that as like elevating our profession or at least helping education professionals in settings like ours be a little bit better understood? I think sometimes people ask like, so what do you do? Like maybe in zoos, it's like, oh, so do you take care of the animals? Or,
Yes. Yeah.
just helping to sort of articulate and where do you see value in just being able to sort of tell that story of what our work is?
Yeah, I mean, I think without getting on too much of a soapbox, education and the social sciences writ large have largely been seen as, and I put heavy quotes around this, women's work, which in our society means that, because we have largely patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalistic systems, they have been fundamentally undervalued to the point of being dismissed because they are more feminized, because they are considered to be fields that are occupied primarily by not even female in like the female sex, but like the feminized archetype. And so I think that is a piece that I'm again really passionate about, is calling that out and saying, we don't ascribe this, like the job of an engineer or a medical doctor is also very dynamic and diverse, but because those are more patriarchal fields, we don't question them the same way that we question fields that are occupied by the feminine. And so I think being able to say like, hey, that's kind of messed up and we need to figure out where that comes from a systemic perspective is really important. And a document, exactly. I'll die if someone says soft sciences one more time. Like soft sciences and hard sciences is a purely prejudicial terminology that's meant to undermine and undervalue social sciences, which are not soft, which are very complicated, and often harder to kind of get, strong data. Now, I'm not going to say one's harder than the other, but like social sciences are really hard. So I think having a document like this that can outline things and say, okay, you want specifics, you want data, here's your data, here's your specifics, like that can help us to elevate that conversation and kind of take away some of those excuses that like socio-emotional skills are soft skills. They're not soft skills, they're social emotional skills. It's a different, they are technical skills. There's techniques that you use to be able to engage with people and, build their psychological well-being or work with people who are neurodiverse or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a document like this helps us to build that case and be able to speak to not only, there's naysayers who are always going to be naysayers, and that's fine. They don't really matter. But like people who maybe have been indoctrinated into these ways of thinking because they live in in the Western world, a predominantly white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic environment.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. So it's like, this can help us articulate and explain what this work really is. And then
Yeah.
it's also a tool, like you talked about it being a tool to help zoo and aquarium educators use it to guide their own professional development. I'm curious if there are components that you see as potentially relevant for public gardens seeking to grow professionally, or maybe it's all relevant. I'm not sure.
I think it's like
Yeah.
I can see content and engagement being molded to your area, evidence-based practice being molded to your area. All four of these, plus the conservation capacity building, I do think, I haven't looked lately to see where conservation falls in your mission statements, but I think it's pretty strong. It comes out pretty strongly in a lot of public gardens. And so, I think you could even just start with these four areas and be like, let's just rewrite this to be about public garden educators. Okay, cool. What's missing? What do we like once we've done that exercise, like what more would we add to that now? Like what do we feel like is not captured? What do we feel like is redundant? What do we feel like isn't really where we're at right at this point in time? And I think that, and then you'll come up with your own founding principles. Equity and justice could be one of them. Safety and well-being could be a part of it, but having those conversations and talking about like, if this is true here, what does that look like for us? I think could take you at least 50% of the way there.
Yeah, and you all got it to a very simple and elegant place, which is pretty impressive. Did you have to consolidate quite a bit, like to get it
We
to
consult,
three and four? Yeah.
yeah, we consolidated a lot and we asked ourselves a lot of questions like, is this really different? Right? Like, is the root of this suggestion actually just yet another safety and well-being, or is that something else? And again, not having that conversation by ourselves, but having those conversations with the larger advisory team, with bringing those questions to the next meeting, the next workshop, whatever, was really important. But Yeah, it took a little bit of massaging and also recognizing outliers and saying not every single suggestion that's going to come to us is going to be included, and that's okay. There's going to be one-offs, people who think this has, you have to include that a conservation education professional makes balloon animals or whatever. But like maybe that's very specific to their facility and we don't have to include it in our document. But thank you very much for your input. But recognizing like what is a critical mass and what is just a couple suggestions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna give folks a last call if you've got further questions you didn't get asked. Go ahead and get them in the chat. And then I've got one kind of closing question that I had in mind for you. If you were to reflect back on these core competencies after they've been out in the world for say 5 or 10 years, in an ideal world, what changes would they have instigated in conservation education or maybe conservation more broadly that would make you and your team that created them feel like they were really accomplishing something that you hoped they would?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, when people talk about them, they talk about them in the same way that they talk about, the strategic plan for the industry or, the guidelines for management of elephants or like any of these big documents that we have, at least in our field, like this sits alongside those as something with equal weight and equal kind of utility. I think success for me would also look like having that conversation in the global world and seeing more zoo and aquarium conservation education professionals have a seat at the table for some of the bigger ICCB conversations, the bigger Society for Conservation Biology conversations. That might be more than 10 years, but I would like to see that this contribute to those more well-rounded professionals who are able to take that seat with confidence. Confidence is an interesting one. I think that's something we haven't touched on that could be a large part of this is that I hope that this gives educators confidence in their abilities and skills, the things they already do really well and the things they want to grow in. I think that would be a big win for me is if we see a workforce that's more confident in their direction, their value, their contributions to the field, that they both feel that internally and are getting external validation for their good work because people can see what excellence looks like from a document like this and how their teams reflect that excellence or are growing towards that excellence. So yeah, those are two. I mean, I would love, love, love to see more educators getting involved in research, getting involved in moving the field forward. I think, we were stuck for a really long time. I think we were kind of floating but pre-pandemic and saying like, yeah, we've got all the time in the world, and then the pandemic came and destroyed our everything. And I think a lot of us realize we don't have all the time in the world, that we need to act now or else we're gonna lose critical space in the conservation conversation. And so we need to, this is the work of educators, is to look at a document like this and say, if we can do all of these things, we will have made an enormous impact on our field. So let's get started.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, that's really inspiring. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this work, to share this work with us. It's been really nice to connect with our peers in the zoo and aquarium world and really understand how many of the same things that we're thinking about